Hi, this is Corey Johnston, and today's lesson is going to be a continuation of a previous lesson from the first chapter in the book of Lamentations. We made it all the way up till the 11th verse. We're going to take it from the 12th to the 22nd. Now, every chapter in the book of Lamentations either has 22 verses or some multiplication thereof. The third chapter has 66 verses, and the reason that there are 22 is because it is arranged in the Hebrew poetry device known as an acrostic. There are 22 letters in the Hebrew language. The presence of vowels are categorically omitted, but there are 22 vowels, and each of these respective verses begin with the alphabetical order in which they appear. Now, the fifth chapter of Lamentations consists of 22 verses, but it is not an acrostic. And the third chapter, which consists of 66 verses, which is 22 times 3, I believe that each, the three verses as they appear begin with the earliest letter of the Hebrew alphabet all the way to the end. But the book of Lamentations, now what is a lamentation? It is a sincere expression of sorrow or grief. And even though the author is identified, the bulk of scholarly consensus is that Jeremiah wrote it. He is known as the weeping prophet. And even though, so this would have been the book of Jeremiah, the book which bears his name, consists of his prophesying during the decline of Judah. This is the deluge. This is when all his prophecies have come to pass. He was a prophet of doom who called the nation to repentance, but they had sinned away their grace, and the Babylonians had come in, taken over, looted, ransacked, destroyed the temple, removed Zedekiah, the king of David's line, and had dispersed them to their land, leaving only the poorest remnant behind. Now we just want to establish a timeline of what we're working with. So in the years 640 to 609 BM, before Messiah, Josiah ruled as king of Judah, and he was the last great reformer. So in the monarchical succession of Judah, not always, but mostly consists of a reformer who tears down the idols of their predecessors, and the idolater erects them right back up. And Jeremiah was called to be a prophet in the year 627. We can read of his calling in the first chapter in the book which bears his name. And he was a prophet all the way up until 580 BC. Now, a lot happened during that time, namely the final irrevocable sack and destruction of his beloved Jerusalem, of which we read of in this chapter. But also in 581, he himself was exiled to Babylon. And in 609, Jehoiakim, as the king of Judah, was taken prisoner to Egypt. Now, Zedekiah was also of the Davidic line, but his claim wasn't as strong. And in fact, Zerubbabel, the first of the post-exilic generation to leave the Jews' home, who was of royal descent, was of Jehoahaz's line. Then Jehoiakim in 609 to 598 BM became the king of Judah, and he was a morally mediocre man. And in the year 605 BM all the way to 562 BM, Nebuchadnezzar was the king of Babylon. He's the one who brought it to its imperial apex. So he conquered Israel in 598. He invaded Judah in three increments, the first of which was 605 BM, then 597 BM, then he finally totally destroyed it in 586. So Jehoiakim became the king of Judah in 597 BM, and in April of that year, Nebuchadnezzar captured Jerusalem, plundered the temple without completely destroying, and took the king captive to prisoner. So the man he had set up in lieu in his stead was very much a puppet monarch who owed his position to his vassal king's grace. And that would have been Zedekiah, who takes it upon himself to rebel behind his vassal lord's master by seeking an alliance with Egypt. So there were three disappointments, the delusions which the nation suffered by. One was that the Davidic dynasty would last forever. This was from an incorrect interpretation of the Davidic covenant of 2 Samuel 7. He promised him a line in perpetuity, and 500 years after his temporal kingdom, the dynasty would cease to exist. A humble carpenter by the name of Joseph married another descendant of his by the name of Mary, Joseph and Mary, and spawned the Messiah, who was to be the fulfillment. His kingdom was not temporal but eternal, and then that the temple could not be destroyed. Now, had Jeremiah's prophetic counsel and advice went heeded, he advised Zedekiah to surrender without resistance to the Babylonians in the interest of destroying the temple, but their beloved treasure would be ransacked on account of their neglecting of his obedience. And the third hope was Egypt. Now they looked to a pagan Gentile king when their faith should have been in Yahweh, and the temptation, Egypt was the one who had once enslaved them, and the temptation was always there. Now we're going to open with the 12th verse, which reads, "Is it not to you, all you who pass by, look and see is if there is any pain like my pain, which has been brought on me, which Yahweh has inflicted on me." So Jeremiah was personally grieved by physical pain, and he's asking that anyone who passed by this desolated ghost town, which lay in devastation and ruin, who had seen the poor spectacle with his eyes, had any notion of anyone else who was in pain to the comparable extent that he was. He was a wretched and miserable creature. He had warned against what came to pass, and now he was stuck living in the fulfillment of his negative prophecy of doom. And Yahweh has inflicted on me, so he takes it personally from Yahweh. And Yahweh did punish even the innocent people of Judah. Jeremiah was innocent. He was not, but an infliction of pain on even the righteous remnant was inescapable because of the covenant violations. They were judged collectively as a community, and they had exhausted their day of grace by this point. So even the righteous remnant like Jeremiah, who warned them against them and gave them the message of repentance, which had they heeded could have avoided the lot they now found themselves in, was not spared of his retribution. And the day of his burning displeasure. So this was the day of his burning displeasure. This is when he had executed his righteous wrath in response and in promise to the consequences for the negative treatment of the covenant nations honoring of their end of the covenant. From above he has sent fire into my bones, and it overpowered them. He has spread a net for my feet and turned me back. He has laid me waste and faint all the day. So Jeremiah considers himself completely at the mercy of Yahweh, who is in physical control. The power which is inflicting him comes from above. It's beyond his reach, and he has sent something comparable to fire in his bones. So he pains in his bones, and he compares it to a quenching fire, which is overpowering me, and he feels trapped in a net. He's in the ghost town, which he can't escape. The food is scarce. Everyone's a beggarly creature. The Babylonians really only left the poorest of the poor behind. And Jeremiah was in a dungeon when, for offering the king the prudent prophetic advice that what was coming to pass, that he was living in now, was soon coming to pass. And he's laid me waste and faint all the days, so there is no rest or recovery or recuperation in his present predicament. The yoke of my transgression has been bound by his hands, woven together and thrust upon my neck. He has made my neck stumble. Yahweh has given me into hands which I am unable to withstand. So the yoke of his transgression. Now Jeremiah was a sinner just like every other person who's ever walked the earth, but as a prophet, he bore the sin and iniquity and its punishment for his people. So he was feeling the yoke of their transgression, which strictly wasn't him. And his strength, he was strong, he was determined to walk the straight and narrow with resolve, but his strength stumbled, and Yahweh had surrendered him into the hands of the Babylonians, whom he was unable to withstand because they were a militarily superior strength, even though he basked in the power and the protection of the Omniscient One. For whatever reason, it was part of his will to leave even the righteous remnant of his faithful servant to the hands and the mercy of their foreign captor, through no fault of his own, but as a consequences for the national calamities and transgressions. Yahweh has trodden down all my strong men in my midst. He has called an appointed time against me to crush my young men. Yahweh has trodden down, as in a winepress, the maiden daughter of Israel. So the winepress is a figure of judgment, and in fact the Garden of Gethsemane was a winepress which trod down, it crushed the grape, much like the symbolically alluding to the son whose skin would be crushed and he would bleed for our behalf, as in a winepress. And this was what happened to Judah and Jerusalem. It was their appointed time. They had had enough. They had sinned away their day of grace, and their young men had to be crushed. Now the young men were not as responsible as the sins of their progenitors, but they nevertheless were not spared the consequences, even though they were too young to not be innocent. And Jeremiah was himself innocent. He had faithfully proclaimed the message of Yahweh, which could have spared the nation. It went unheeded, and through no fault of his own, he had to bear the punishment of his message gone unheeding. And he was a skillful preacher. By the worldly measure, he was a failure as a preacher. He could not attract an audience. No one liked what he had to say. Certainly few, if any, people would pay to hear what he has to say. He walked around the street beggarly, while the false prophet, arrayed in robes and riches, attracted greater audience. But the success of a minister is how they faithfully and accurately communicate the message they are commanded to convey. And in this life, Jeremiah was a stunning and remarkable success. This is why I weep. My eye is running down with water, because the Comforter, who could bring me back my life, has been far from me. My children are stunned, for the enemy has prevailed. Jeremiah once more is the weeping prophet, largely because he lived to witness the destruction and ultimately the decline in the deluge of his beloved city. He had given the message which could have spared it of this faith, but his message went unheeded, and he watched before his eyes an entire nation of people violate the covenant in spite of his warning. So this was a cause and occasion for mourning, grieving, and crying. So his tears were not without reason. They were running down his face like water, and he felt comfortless, because the Comforter, that would be the divine Comforter, the Spirit, is our Comforter in the new covenant. And he is the one who can rejuvenate, regenerate, and quicken our life. But Jeremiah feels distance and alienated from him, because the enemy, he has not been protected by him from the enemy. So what kind of comforter is this that would allow him to suffer so? Zion spreads out her hands. There is no comfort for her. Yahweh has commanded concerning Jacob. His neighbors are his adversaries. Jerusalem has been an uncleanness among them. Zion was the sacred hill where the temple once dwelled, but it had been irrevocably destructed by 586 BM. It could have been spared once more, because Jeremiah offered Zedekiah the advice to surrender without resistance. In the interests of sparing the temple, it lay in smoke and ruins because of this, and there was no one to comfort for her, because Jacob is the name of an individual, also the name of Israel, and everyone around them were his enemies. Now the nation of Edom, who was Jacob, the descendants of Jacob's older twin brother Esau, had joined the Babylonians in the plundering, and this is the message of the prophet Obadiah, that they would be betrayed by their ally on account of their treachery. But Jerusalem had been reduced to a shame of spectacle and an uncleanness among those who dwelled around him. Yahweh is righteous, for I rebelled against his mouth. Hear now, all people, and see my pain. My maidens and my young men have gone into captivity. So in spite of all the calamity and the injustice he personally felt, he did not lose his unshakable faith and the righteousness of Yahweh. His punishment is righteousness, so whenever he acts in a contrary or a manner that is contrary to what we would like or what we would be comfort, his righteousness does not diminish. Judah had fully merited the retribution and the wrath that had been inflicted upon them. Even though Jeremiah did not, he identified in he personalized it, I rebelled against his mouth. Now he had faithfully and accurately proclaimed and repeated the message that he had been given to Yahweh, yet he confesses that he was a rebel in his mouth, and he wants all the people in eyesight to see his pain. He said something like this, something similar to this earlier. And he was alone, virtually alone in a ghost town, but most of the young men had been carried and captivated off into captivity to the central city of Babylon as a means of population control. I called for my lovers, but they deceived me. My priests and my elders breathed their last in the city, while they sought food to bring back their life. So the lovers would have been their allies, and the temptation for the secular kings was to place their faith in military alliances with pagan Gentile kings, such as Egypt and even Babylon against Assyria earlier. But any faith in any Gentile nation is inferior and unreliable and is ultimately bound to betray, whereas the prophet, Isaiah's especially, repeated injunction was to place their faith in Yahweh where it belongs, not to any pagan nation outside them, but to Yahweh above, who will not lead them astray, who will protect them, preserve them, guide them, and keep them, and prosper them. So these lovers had deceived them, and the priests, they were going through the mechanical, ritualistic rites of sacrifice. They thought that was sufficient to protect the nation from the divine wrath which is headed its way, but they didn't even have a temple to offer the sacrifices and more, and the priests were responsible for failing to provide the people with the necessary and proper instruction on the law. And so there's usually a dichotomy between the prophets and the priest. See, O Yahweh, that I am in distress. My inward parts are boiling up. My heart is overturned within me. For I have been very rebellious. From without the sword has bereaved. At home it is like death. So once more, Jeremiah, even though none of us would consider him rebellious, he considers himself rebellious. He is identifying in the collective national sins. So that is the second time he says that he is rebellious, and it consumes him from head to toe, from inward to out. And the sword and death are comparable experiences to what he is going through. He feels spiritually dead and doesn't have much of a reason to live or get up in the morning in his present predicament. He is a man in pain and in plight, and with seemingly no relief in sight. They have heard that I sighed, with no one to comfort me. All my enemies have heard of my calamity. They have rejoiced that you have done it. You shall bring on the day that you have announced. So let them become like me. So the reputation of his suffering, he wanted it spread abroad, and this is the state of hopelessness. He feels he has no comforter. at this moment in time, he feels abandoned and forsaken by the same Yahweh who had called him into a prophet. And all of his enemies, the reputation had spread to them that his plight, his dilemma, was overwhelming and overburdening him. And this was all a part of the appointed day, of which we read of in verse 15. Here we read, the day you have announced, so it was appointed, it was come to pass. And Jeremiah knew it had to come to pass, but now that he was there, it was a lot more awful than he perhaps originally envisioned. And so he prays to let his adversaries experience what he is going through now. This is what is known as an imprecatory prayer, whereby we wish curses to befall amongst the enemies of Yahweh. 22nd and final verse. Let all their evil deeds come before you, and do to them as you have done to me, for all my transgressions, for my sighs are many, and my heart is faint. So these pagan nations around Israel were even more wicked than Israel. Of course, they did not have the lofty standards to obey in the covenant. They had no moral models in their religion or in their law. Yet Israel was bound to them, and because they had failed and were indistinct from the pagan foreign idolaters around them, they were visited by punishment. And of course, all their captors would meet their due. So Babylon would be displaced by the Medo-Persians, who would in turn be displaced by the Grecians, who would in turn be displaced by the Romans, who in turn would be displaced by the barbarians. And that is kind of the trajectory of history of the age of the Gentiles, which really begins in 586, of which we are reading about right about now. But that's all the time we have for today. Thank you so much. I'll see you soon. Take care until next time. Bye-bye.